Imagine being married for 58 years, raising 5 children together, building a life from nothing, and then watching your husband of nearly 6 decades pack his bags to move in with a girl who could be your great-granddaughter. This is the true story of Margaret Thompson, a 76-year-old woman who thought she knew everything about love, loyalty, and marriage until the day her world came crashing down. But what happened next wasn't just about heartbreak and betrayal. What happened next was about justice, karma, and the sweetest revenge you could ever imagine. And trust me, by the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes the universe has the most perfect way of settling scores. If stories like this touch your heart, if you believe that good people deserve justice and that karma always finds a way, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more incredible, true stories, and let me know in the comments if you've ever witnessed justice being served in the most unexpected way. Your support means everything to us, and your stories inspire us to keep sharing these powerful testimonies. My name is Margaret Thompson, and until 18 months ago, I thought I had lived a fairy tale life. I met my husband Robert when I was 17 years old, working as a secretary in a small accounting firm in Ohio. He was 22, fresh out of college, and had just started his first job as a junior accountant. We fell in love over shared lunches and long conversations about our dreams for the future. He wanted to build his own business someday, and I wanted to create a beautiful family and a warm home where love would always be the foundation. We got married 2 years later, in 1967, in a small ceremony at our local church. I wore my mother's wedding dress, altered to fit me perfectly, and Robert wore a suit he had saved for months to buy. We didn't have much money, but we had love, hope, and an unshakable belief that together we could overcome anything life threw our way. Our honeymoon was a 3-day trip to Niagara Falls, and I remember thinking as I watched those powerful waters that our love was just as strong and eternal. Our early years were challenging but beautiful. Robert worked long hours while studying at night to get his CPA certification, and I took care of our home and, soon enough, our growing family. Our first child, David, was born in 1969, followed by Susan in 1971, then the twins Michael and Michelle in 1973, and finally our youngest, Jennifer, in 1976. Our little house was always full of laughter, chaos, and unconditional love. I devoted my entire life to being the perfect wife and mother. I cooked Robert's favorite meals, kept our home spotless, raised our children with values and discipline, and supported his career every step of the way. When he finally opened his own accounting firm in 1982, I was his biggest cheerleader, working as his unpaid assistant, answering phones, organizing files, and doing whatever needed to be done to help him succeed. The business grew slowly but steadily. Robert was honest, hardworking, and brilliant with numbers, and word spread about his integrity and expertise. By the 1990s, Thompson Accounting had become one of the most respected firms in our county. We bought a larger house, sent all 5 children to college, and finally began to enjoy the fruits of our decades of hard work and sacrifice. I thought we were living proof that true love and partnership could overcome any obstacle. We celebrated our 25th anniversary with a trip to Europe, something we had dreamed about since our honeymoon. On our 40th anniversary, Robert surprised me with a renewal of our wedding vows, telling our children and grandchildren that I was still the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, and that loving me had been the greatest privilege of his life. But somewhere along the way, things began to change, so gradually that I didn't notice at first. Robert started working later hours, claiming that the business was more demanding than ever. He became distant during our conversations, often distracted, and checking his phone constantly. When I asked if something was wrong, he would kiss my forehead and tell me he was just stressed about work, that it would pass soon. The first real sign that something was seriously wrong came during our 55th anniversary celebration. Our children had organized a beautiful party at our country club, with family and friends who had been part of our journey for decades. I was so happy, surrounded by our 5 children, 14 grandchildren, and even our first great-grandchild, little Emma, who was just 6 months old. But Robert seemed uncomfortable all evening, checking his phone every few minutes and excusing himself multiple times to take calls. When our son David asked him to give a speech about our marriage, Robert's words felt hollow and rehearsed. Nothing like the passionate declarations of love I was used to hearing from him. That night, lying in bed, I asked him directly if he was happy in our marriage. He looked at me with eyes I didn't recognize and said, "Margaret, we're old. We're just going through the motions now." Those words hit me like a physical blow. Going through the motions? After 58 years of building a life together, after raising 5 children, after supporting each other through illnesses, financial struggles, the loss of our parents, and every other challenge life had thrown our way, he thought we were just going through the motions. I tried to dismiss his comment as a moment of midlife crisis or work stress, but things continued to deteriorate. Robert became increasingly critical of everything I did. My cooking wasn't as good as it used to be. I was letting myself go physically. I talked too much about the grandchildren. I was boring and predictable. Every criticism felt like a dagger to my heart. But I kept trying harder, thinking that if I could just be better, more interesting, more attractive, our marriage could return to what it once was. The truth came out on a Tuesday morning in March, in the most brutal way possible. I was doing laundry when I found a receipt in Robert's pants pocket for a jewelry store. My heart fluttered with excitement, thinking he might be planning a surprise for our upcoming anniversary. But when I looked closer, I saw the date was from the previous week, and the amount was for over $3,000. We had never spent that much on jewelry, even for our major anniversaries. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to call the jewelry store to ask about the purchase, thinking I could plan my reaction better if I knew what surprise Robert had planned. When I spoke to the sales associate who had handled the transaction, she mentioned that the jewelry was for his young girlfriend, and that she had helped them pick out the perfect engagement ring. The world stopped spinning. I hung up the busy phone and sat in my laundry room for over an hour, trying to process what I had just heard. An engagement ring. For his young girlfriend. My husband of 58 years was not only having an affair, but he was planning to marry someone else. When Robert came home that evening, I confronted him with the receipt and what I had learned. I expected denials, explanations, apologies, something that would help me understand how we had gotten to this point. Instead, Robert looked almost relieved that his secret was finally out. He sat down across from me at our kitchen table, the same table where we had shared thousands of meals and conversations, and told me the truth with a coldness that still chills me to remember. Her name was Brittany, he said. She was 24 years old, the same age as our granddaughter Sarah. She worked as a receptionist at a medical office in the building next to his accounting firm. They had met 8 months earlier when he went to see a doctor about his back pain, and she had been so fresh and exciting compared to what he called my predictable routine. "Margaret," he said, looking me straight in the eyes, "I love you. I always will, but I'm not in love with you anymore. Brittany makes me feel young again, alive again. She looks at me like I'm the most interesting man in the world, not like I'm just the guy who takes out the trash and pays the bills. I want to spend whatever years I have left feeling that excitement again." I asked him about our vows, about our family, about the life we had built together. He said he would always be grateful for everything we had shared, but that he couldn't pretend anymore. He was going to divorce me and marry Brittany, and he hoped I would understand that this wasn't about me not being enough. It was about him needing something different at this stage of his life. The divorce proceedings were swift and brutal. Robert had already consulted with lawyers and had everything planned out. Because he owned the accounting firm and had been the primary breadwinner throughout our marriage, his legal team argued that I was entitled to only a modest settlement. The house would need to be sold, with proceeds split equally. I would receive alimony, but not enough to maintain anything close to the lifestyle I had known. Our children were devastated and furious with their father. David, our oldest, tried to talk sense into Robert, reminding him of everything I had sacrificed for our family and his career. Susan cried for weeks, unable to understand how the father who had taught her about love and commitment could do something so heartless. The twins refused to speak to Robert at all, and Jennifer, our youngest, told him that he was dead to her. But Robert seemed immune to their pleas and anger. He was completely infatuated with Brittany, acting like a teenager in love for the first time. He bought her expensive clothes, took her on exotic vacations, and paraded her around town like a trophy. I heard from friends that he had introduced her to his business associates as his fiancée, and that she called him Bobby, a nickname that no one had used since he was a child. The most humiliating moment came when I ran into them at the grocery store where I had shopped for nearly 4 decades. Brittany was hanging on Robert's arm, wearing clothes that cost more than I now spent on groceries in a month. When she saw me, she whispered something to Robert, and they both looked at me with what I can only describe as pity. Robert nodded politely and said, "Hello, Margaret. You look well." Then they walked away, leaving me standing there with my cart full of store-brand products, feeling invisible and forgotten. The wedding took place 6 months after our divorce was finalized. I learned about it from a photo that Jennifer showed me reluctantly, something she had seen on social media. Robert, 78 years old, standing next to Brittany in an elaborate white dress, both of them beaming at the camera. The caption read, "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, starting our beautiful life together." It was like a knife through my heart, seeing him take the name we had shared for nearly 6 decades and give it to someone else. I spent the following months in the darkest depression of my life. I moved into a small apartment, using most of my settlement money to pay the first year's rent. I felt invisible, discarded, like a piece of furniture that had served its purpose and was no longer needed. I questioned everything about my life, wondering if the love I thought Robert and I had shared had been real, or if I had been deluding myself for decades. My children tried to help, inviting me for dinners and family events, but I could see the pity in their eyes, and I hated being the sad, abandoned mother whose presence reminded everyone of their father's betrayal. My grandchildren didn't know how to act around me, unsure whether they should mention their grandfather or pretend he didn't exist. But then, exactly 1 year after Robert's wedding to Brittany, something extraordinary happened. I received a phone call that would change everything and show me that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe has a perfect sense of justice. The call came from Robert's former business partner, James Mitchell, a man I had known for over 20 years. James sounded nervous and asked if he could come over to discuss something important about Robert and the accounting firm. When he arrived at my apartment, he looked uncomfortable but determined. James told me that for the past year, he had been noticing irregularities in the firm's finances. Money was disappearing from client accounts, and when he tried to discuss it with Robert, he was told that everything was fine and that he shouldn't worry about issues that didn't concern him. But James's suspicions grew stronger, and he finally decided to conduct his own investigation. What he discovered was staggering. Robert had been embezzling money from the accounting firm for over 2 years, starting around the time he met Brittany. He had stolen nearly $400,000 from various client accounts, using the money to fund his new lifestyle with his young wife. The expensive vacations, jewelry, clothes, and even the elaborate wedding had all been paid for with stolen money. James had documented everything and was planning to go to the authorities, but he wanted to talk to me first. He felt I deserved to know what was happening, especially since some of the stolen money had been used to reduce the settlement I received in the divorce. Robert had hidden assets and manipulated financial records to make it appear that the business was less profitable than it actually was. I was stunned. The man I had been married to for 58 years, the man I had trusted completely, had not only abandoned me for a woman young enough to be his great-granddaughter, but he had also stolen money and cheated me out of what was rightfully mine. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that I felt numb. James asked what I thought he should do. Part of me wanted to protect Robert, even after everything he had done to me. But then I thought about all the clients who trusted him with their money, all the people who could be hurt by his crimes, and I knew there was only one right thing to do. "Turn him in," I told James. "He made his choices, and now he has to face the consequences." James contacted the FBI the next day, and within a week, federal agents were conducting a full investigation into the accounting firm. The evidence was overwhelming, and Robert was arrested at his office on a Friday morning while Brittany waited in the car outside, probably expecting them to go to lunch at some expensive restaurant. The trial was a media sensation in our the town. Robert Thompson, once one of the most respected businessmen in the county, was facing federal charges for embezzlement, wire fraud, and tax evasion. The local newspaper covered every detail, and I watched from a distance as the man I had once loved more than life itself was exposed as a criminal and a fraud. But the real justice, the sweetest part of this entire story, came during the trial. When more details about Robert and Brittany's relationship emerged, It turns out that Brittany hadn't been the innocent young woman seduced by an older man that everyone had assumed she was. She had a history of targeting wealthy older men, and Robert wasn't her first victim. The FBI investigation revealed that Brittany had been married twice before, both times to men over 70, and both marriages had ended with her receiving substantial financial settlements. She had specifically sought out Robert after learning about his successful business and had calculated every move in their relationship. Even more shocking was the revelation that Brittany had been stealing from Robert as well. While he was embezzling money from his clients to support their lifestyle, she was secretly transferring money from their joint accounts to accounts in her own name. She had convinced Robert to put her name on several of his assets, and then she had been systematically draining their value. When Robert was arrested, Brittany's true character was finally revealed. She immediately filed for divorce, claiming that she had no knowledge of his criminal activities and that she was as much a victim as anyone else. She hired the most expensive lawyer she could find, using the money she had stolen from Robert, and fought for her share of his remaining assets. The irony was perfect. Robert had betrayed me, his faithful wife of 58 years, for a woman who was betraying him even more thoroughly than he had betrayed me. He had thrown away a lifetime of love and loyalty for someone who had never loved him at all, someone who had been playing a role to get access to his money. During the trial, I learned that Brittany had been cheating on Robert with multiple men, including his own lawyer's son, who was closer to her age. She had been caught on surveillance cameras taking expensive jewelry and cash from their home and giving them to her real boyfriend. She had even tried to take out a life insurance policy on Robert, naming herself as the beneficiary. Robert was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to all the clients he had stolen from. At 78 years old, he would likely spend the rest of his functional life behind bars. All of his assets were seized to pay back his victims, including the house he had shared with Brittany and the expensive jewelry he had bought her. Brittany, meanwhile, was also charged with fraud and conspiracy. Her past caught up with her when the FBI investigation revealed her pattern of targeting older men. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to return all the money she had stolen from Robert and her previous husbands. The sweetest justice of all came when I received a check from the Federal Restitution Fund. Not only did I get back all the money that Robert had hidden from me during our divorce, but I also received additional compensation for the suffering and financial hardship I had endured. The amount was enough to buy a beautiful house in the neighborhood where Robert and I had once lived together, and to secure my financial future for the rest of my life. But the money wasn't the most satisfying part of this story. The real satisfaction came from watching Robert's fantasy life crumble around him, seeing him realize that he had thrown away something real and precious for something that was completely fake. In the courtroom, during his sentencing, he looked across the room at me, and I saw in his eyes the recognition of what he had lost. After the trial, Robert wrote me a letter from prison. In it, he apologized for everything he had done and admitted that losing me was the biggest mistake of his life. He said that Brittany had never loved him, that he had been a fool to believe that someone her age could genuinely care for someone his age, and that he now understood the difference between real love and manipulation. He asked for my forgiveness, not because he expected me to take him back, but because he wanted to die knowing that the woman who had loved him faithfully for 58 years didn't hate him. He said that every day in prison he thought about our life together, about the family we had raised and the love we had shared, and he realized that he had destroyed the most valuable thing he had ever possessed. I never responded to his letter. Not because I hate him, but because some betrayals are so complete that forgiveness doesn't change anything. Robert made his choice when he decided that a young body and a pretty face were more important than a lifetime of love and loyalty. He chose excitement over commitment, fantasy over reality, and in the end, he got exactly what he deserved. Today, 3 years later, I live in my beautiful new home, surrounded by my children and grandchildren who visit me regularly. I volunteer at our local literacy center, teaching adults to read, and I've discovered talents and interests that I never had time to explore during my decades of marriage. I travel with my daughters, I garden, I read voraciously, and I've even started taking art classes. My great-granddaughter Emma, who is now 4 years old, comes to stay with me every weekend. She calls me her best friend grandma, and when she hugs me, I remember that love doesn't have to be romantic to be profound and meaningful. The love of family, the love of friends, the love of purpose and self-respect are all forms of love that no one can take away from you. I learned that justice isn't always immediate, but it is inevitable. Robert thought he could discard me like an old appliance and replace me with a newer model, but the universe had other plans. His newer model turned out to be a predator who was using him more ruthlessly than he had used me. His quest for excitement led him to prison, bankruptcy, and complete disgrace. Meanwhile, I discovered that being alone doesn't mean being lonely, and that starting over at 76 is not only possible but can be incredibly liberating. I don't have to cook meals I don't want to eat, watch television shows I don't enjoy, or pretend to be interested in conversations that bore me. I can be completely myself for the first time in decades. The sweetest justice of all is that I am genuinely happy now, happier than I was during those last years of my marriage when I was trying so hard to be perfect enough to keep a man who had already decided I wasn't worth keeping. I wake up every morning grateful for my freedom, my family, my health, and my future. Sometimes people ask me if I miss being married, if I'm lonely, if I wish Robert would get out of prison and try to reconcile with me. The answer is simple. I miss being married to the man I thought Robert was, but that man was probably gone long before I realized it. I'm not lonely because I've learned that being with the wrong person is lonelier than being alone. And as for reconciliation, some bridges are meant to be burned completely. Robert lost everything that truly mattered for something that was never real. I lost a husband who had already lost his way, but I gained my self-respect, my independence, and the knowledge that I can not only survive betrayal, but thrive after it. And that, my friends, is the sweetest justice of all.